In the spring of 1888, a man unfolded his morning newspaper and discovered that he was dead. The room was quiet, the Mediterranean lights spilling across polished wood and unopened letters. Outside, the world moved as it always had, carriages rolling, markets trading, soldiers drilling somewhere far away. Yet in that moment, time seemed to hesitate. Ink on cheap paper had already judged him. The headline was merciless. "The Merchant of Death is dead," he read the words once. Then again, they did not soften. According to the obituary, he had grown rich by finding new ways to kill more people, faster than ever before. He had amassed a fortune by perfecting destruction. His life, the paper declared, had been devoted to making war more terrible. It was not even meant for him. The dead man was his brother. The condemnation, however, was entirely his own. For years he had lived between laboratories and drawing rooms, between brilliant invention and quiet isolation. He had believed himself a builder of tunnels, of railways, of progress. But here, in cold type, he was something else entirely, a profiteer of blood. In that instant, a question took root that would not leave him. If this is how the world remembers me, what, then, have I truly built? Welcome to Old Money Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of the richest families and most powerful figures in history. If you are drawn to grand fortunes, private conflicts, glittering salons, and the hidden emotional costs behind success, then this channel is for you. If you enjoyed this story and want more riveting historical journeys, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of old money. Chapter 1. Alfred Nobel. The Rise to Power. 1.1. Early Life and Origins 1833 to 1859. On the 21st of October 1833, in a modded house in Stockholm, a boy was born into uncertainty. His name was Alfred Bernhard Nobel. He did not enter a palace or a banking dynasty. He entered a household teetering on collapse. His father, Emmanuel Nobel, was an engineer of restless ambition, inventive, imaginative, but chronically unlucky in business. By 1837, when Alfred was only 4, Emmanuel's ventures in Sweden had failed. Bankruptcy followed. Debts mounted. Respect evaporated. What remained was pride, and a belief that ingenuity could conquer humiliation. In 1842, the family made a decisive move. Emmanuel relocated to St. Petersburg, Russia, where opportunity was tied to empire, and empire was tied to war. The Russian military needed engineers. Emmanuel provided underwater mines for the defense of naval ports. Contracts came. Money returned. The Nobel name regained stability, though it was stability built upon armament. Young Alfred grew up between worlds. Swedish in origin, Russian in upbringing, European in intellect. Unlike many industrial heirs, he did not attend formal school. Instead, he was educated privately by tutors. Chemistry, physics, literature, and languages filled his days. By 17, he spoke Swedish, Russian, French, English, and German fluently. Words fascinated him almost as much as formulas. He wrote poetry in English and dreamed, briefly, of becoming a writer, but his father had other expectations. Emmanuel believed in practical achievement, engineering, invention, utility. The world respected those who built things that governments would pay for. Literature did not guarantee contracts. In 1850, Alfred was sent abroad to refine his scientific training. He studied in Paris under the renowned chemist Théophile Jules Pellos. There, he encountered a substance that would define his life, nitrogen. It had been discovered in 1847 by the Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero. Sobrero himself warned against its use. It was violently unstable. A slight shock, a change in temperature, and it could detonate with devastating force. He considered it too dangerous to serve any practical purpose. Alfred disagreed. Where Sobrero saw chaos, Alfred saw possibility. He believed that instability was not a reason for abandonment, but a problem to be solved. If controlled nitroglycerin could transform mining, tunneling, railway construction, the very infrastructure of modern civilization. Yet, even as he immersed himself in science, shadows followed. The Crimean War ended in 1856. Russian military contracts vanished. Alfred Nobel's business collapsed again. Bankruptcy struck the family a second time. The illusion of permanent success dissolved. Alfred returned to Sweden with little security and even less certainty. These repeated rises and falls marked him deeply. Wealth could disappear. Reputation could evaporate. Survival required adaptation and nerve. He was not naturally warm. Friends described him as reserved, even melancholic. Later in life he would write, "I am a misanthrope, and yet utterly benevolent." The contradiction was already forming. He distrusted crowds but believed in progress. He doubted humanity, yet wanted to improve its condition. In Stockholm he resumed experiments with nitroglycerin alongside his father. It was dangerous work. Laboratories were primitive. Safety measures were minimal. Yet Alfred pursued refinement obsessively. He believed that if he could stabilize this volatile liquid, he could turn danger into opportunity. Behind this scientific drive lay something more personal. He had watched his father's pride crumble twice. He had seen how swiftly society dismissed a failed businessman. Alfred did not merely want success. He wanted permanence. He wanted a creation so powerful that it could not be ignored or erased. He was still in his 20s. The world did not yet know his name, but the foundations were already laid. Linguistic brilliance, scientific ambition, emotional isolation, and a willingness to gamble with risk. What he could not yet see was that the very substance he sought to tame would one day tame him instead. Not in body, but in reputation. The boy who once dreamed of poetry was inching towards an invention that would echo across battlefields and mountains alike. And in chasing control over explosions, he was unknowingly lighting the fuse of his own moral reckoning. 1.2 Key decisions, and first success 1859 to 1867. By 1859, Alfred Nobel was no longer a gifted son in his father's shadow. He was a man with a dangerous idea. Nitroglycerin remained a scientific curiosity, feared, unstable, unpredictable. Governments had shown little interest. Industrialists regarded it as madness in liquid form. Even its discoverer, Sabretto, warned repeatedly that it should never be handled outside controlled laboratory conditions. But Alfred saw what others refused to imagine. The Industrial Revolution was tearing through Europe. Railways demanded tunnels through mountains. Mines dug deeper each year in search of coal and iron. Traditional black powder was too weak, too inefficient. It limited progress. Alfred believed nitroglycerin, Yves Stabile said, could blast open the earth itself. It was not only ambition that drove him. It was urgency. The Nobel family finances were fragile once more. His father's ventures had faltered. Alfred needed a breakthrough, not eventually, but soon. He began experimenting seriously in Sweden, determined to find a safe method of detonating nitroglycerin in controlled blasts. The first major innovation came in 1863, when he invented a practical detonator using a small wooden plug and black powder. It allowed for more predictable explosions. It was imperfect, but it was a step forward. Then came tragedy. On the 3rd of September 1864, an explosion tore through the Nobel laboratory at Heleneborg, just outside Stockholm. The blast was catastrophic. Buildings were reduced to debris. Several workers were killed. Among the dead was Alfred's youngest brother, Emil Nobel. Emil was only 20. The loss was devastating, both personally and publicly. Newspapers condemned the recklessness of the experiments. Authorities in Stockholm banned further nitroglycerin production within city limits. Alfred was accused of endangering lives for profit. For many men, the death of a younger brother might have ended the pursuit entirely. The substance had proven its cruelty. It had struck his own family. But Alfred did not abandon it. Instead, he adapted. Forced out of the city, he moved his experiments onto a barge anchored on Lake Mal. If another explosion occurred, it would at least be isolated from residential areas. The image was almost symbolic. A solitary figure, working with volatile forces, drifting slightly apart from society. Those who observed him during this period described a man growing quieter, more withdrawn. The grief did not soften him. It sharpened his resolve. If nitroglycerin remained unpredictable, more deaths would follow. The only way to honor the loss was to master the danger completely. The breakthrough came in 1867. Alfred discovered that when nitroglycerin was absorbed into a porous material called kieselguhr, a type of diatomaceous earth, it became significantly more stable and easier to handle. The mixture could be shaped into rods, transported more safely, and detonated in a controlled manner. He patented the invention under a new name: dynamite. The word derived from the Greek dynamis, meaning power. Dynamite transformed construction almost overnight. It allowed engineers to carve tunnels through mountains that had once seemed impenetrable. It accelerated railway expansion across Europe and North America. Mines increased output. Infrastructure projects that had taken years could now be completed in months. Orders soared. Factories were established across Europe. Investors who had once hesitated now competed for partnership. Within a few short years, Alfred Nobel was no longer a struggling experimenter. He was in an industrial force. Recognition followed. Scientific societies acknowledged his ingenuity. Governments granted patents. Financial security, once elusive, began to solidify. Yet success carried a shadow. Dynamite was designed for industry, but it did not belong exclusively to industry. Military officials quickly recognized its potential. Explosives were not neutral tools. They served whoever wielded them. Alfred attempted to maintain a distinction. He insisted that his inventions were primarily for construction and development. He saw himself as a builder of bridges, tunnels, and modern civilization. In private writings, he suggested that powerful weapons might even deter war. If destruction became sufficiently terrifying, perhaps nations would hesitate before conflict. "If I have 1,000 ideas, and only one turns out to be good," he once said, "I am satisfied." Dynamite was more than good. It was revolutionary. But revolutions do not ask permission before changing the world. By the end of the 1860s, Alfred Nobel had secured patents in multiple countries. Wealth flowed steadily. His name appeared in engineering circles with admiration. He had taken the most unstable substance known to chemistry and bent it toward usefulness. Yet beneath the triumph lay unresolved questions. Emile was still dead. Workers had still perished. And now, governments were watching. Alfred had achieved what he sought since childhood, a creation that could not be ignored. His invention reshaped landscapes. It promised lasting relevance. But in conquering instability, he'd also ensured that his fortune would always be tied to force. The first success had arrived. So had the first moral compromise, though he had not yet fully recognized it as such. 1.3 Expansion of power, 1867 to 1888. By the early 1870s, Alfred Nobel was no longer merely an inventor. He was becoming an empire. Dynamite had proven its worth across Europe. Mountains that once resisted human ambition yielded to controlled blasts. Railway tunnels cut through the Alps. Canals deepened. Mines reached unprecedented depths. Industrialization demanded speed, and Nobel's invention provided it. He understood something crucial. Invention alone did not guarantee dominance. Distribution did. Rather than licensing his patents loosely, Alfred established factories across national borders. Germany, Britain, France, Italy, the United States. Each became a node in a growing industrial network. By the 1880s, he controlled nearly 90 factories and laboratories in more than 20 countries. He traveled constantly, often alone. His life became a sequence of trains, steamships, and hotel rooms. He carried notebooks everywhere, refining formulas and sketching new devices. Over his lifetime, he would secure 355 patents. His wealth expanded rapidly. Investments multiplied, contracts strengthened. By his mid-50s, Alfred Nobel had amassed one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. Yet he lived without ostentation. Though he owned residences in Paris, San Remo, and Calistoga, they were functional rather than flamboyant. He preferred laboratories to ballrooms. Still, he entered elite society. In Paris especially, he moved among intellectual circles. Writers, scientists, diplomats. He spoke elegantly in several languages and could discuss literature as fluently as chemistry. Those who met him often found him intense but courteous, intellectually sharp yet emotionally guarded. He never married. There were relationships, but none endured. He once placed a newspaper advertisement seeking a mature lady, versed in languages, to serve as his secretary. The position briefly brought a remarkable woman into his life, Bertha Kinsky, later known as Bertha von Sa. She worked for him in 1876, though only for a short time. Their professional arrangement ended quickly, but a correspondence began that would last decades. Bertha would later become a leading voice in the European peace movement and author of the influential novel Lay Down Your Arms in 1889. Their letters reveal a different Alfred Nobel, reflective, philosophical, at times bleak. He admired her intellect deeply. Some historians believe he loved her, though circumstances and distance prevented anything lasting. Bertha believed passionately that organized peace efforts could prevent war. Alfred remained skeptical. He argued that if weapons became powerful enough, the horror of war would render it obsolete. It was a chilling logic. Deterrence through terror. My factories, he once wrote to her, may make an end of war sooner than your congresses. The statement carried both conviction and unease, for as his empire grew, so too did military interest. Dynamite was powerful, but Alfred did not stop there. In 1875, he developed blasting gelatine, even more potent and stable. In 1887, he patented ballastite, one of the first smokeless powders suitable for firearms and artillery. Ballastite drew the attention of governments immediately. Italy adopted it. France accused him of betraying national interests by sharing military technology abroad. Suspicion clouded his reputation in Paris, forcing him eventually to relocate much of his residence to Italy. He had become wealthy beyond the dreams of his childhood, yet he was increasingly viewed through a narrow lens. Arms manufacturer. Publicly, he defended his work as scientific progress. Privately, letter suggests deeper contemplation. He wrestled with the unpredictability of how inventions were used. An explosive could carve a railway tunnel or devastate a battlefield. The inventor controlled neither intention nor outcome once the patent left his hands. Despite vast resources, Alfred's personal life remained austere. He worked obsessively. Servants reported that he ate irregularly, slept little, and kept late hours in his laboratories. He suffered from bouts of melancholy and recurring health problems, including heart pains that would later be diagnosed as angina. Isolation became his quiet companion. His brothers, Ludwig and Robert, found success in the oil industry in Baku, building their own considerable fortunes. Yet Alfred remained apart, geographically and temperamentally. He seemed most comfortable among chemicals and calculations rather than relatives or admirers. By the late 1880s, he stood at the height of his influence. Industrial magnates respected him. Governments negotiated with him. Scientists acknowledged his brilliance. His financial empire spanned continents. And yet, beneath the expansion lay a subtle erosion. The more powerful his inventions became, the less control he possessed over their moral direction. Each new patent strengthened his wealth, but complicated his legacy. The very technologies that modernized infrastructure also intensified warfare's efficiency. He had achieved permanence of name, but permanence, he would soon discover, did not guarantee admiration. In 1888, while residing in France, news arrived that his brother Ludwig had died. Newspapers mistakenly believed it was Alfred who had passed away. One French publication seized the moment to publish his obituary prematurely. The headline was brutal. It called him the Merchant of Death, a man who had grown rich by enabling armies to kill more swiftly and effectively than ever before. For decades, he had built an empire of controlled explosions. Now, in a single column of print, that empire was morally defined. The rise to power was complete. So too was the shadow that accompanied it. Chapter 2. The rivalry begins. 2.1. The first conflict. 1888. In April 1888, death visited the Nobel family, but not in the way the newspapers believed. Ludwig Nobel, Alfred's older brother and a powerful oil industrialist in Baku, had died. His business empire in the Russian petroleum fields had made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. The Nobel name, already associated with explosives, now carried oil, industry, and influence. But in Paris, where Alfred was residing, confusion traveled faster than accuracy. A French newspaper mistakenly reported that Alfred Nobel himself had died. Without verification, editors composed an obituary based not on sentiment, but on reputation. The headline was unforgettable. Le Marchand de la Mort est mort. The Merchant of Death is dead. The article declared that the man who had discovered ways to kill more people faster than ever before had finally succumbed. It suggested that his wealth had been built on human suffering. It implied that history would remember him not as an inventor, but as a profiteer of destruction. Alfred was very much alive when he read it. There is no record of him shouting or publicly protesting. He did not demand retractions. He did not issue statements to defend himself. Instead, those close to him observed a silence that felt heavier than anger. For perhaps the first time, he saw his life summarized without nuance. No mention of railway tunnels through the Alps. No praise for engineering innovation. No recognition of intellectual brilliance. Only death. Only profit. Only war. The obituary did not invent facts. Dynamite had been used in warfare. Ballastite was a military propellant. Governments had purchased his patents eagerly. The article merely stripped away justification and left the bare moral question exposed. Had he, in seeking to advance industry, armed the machinery of conflict beyond repair? The conflict that began in 1888 was not with a rival industrialist, nor with a competing dynasty. It was more intimate and more relentless. It was a rivalry between two versions of himself. On one side stood Alfred Nobel, the engineer, pragmatic, innovative, convinced that technology was neutral and that responsibility lay with those who wielded it. On the other stood Alfred Nobel, the philosopher, introspective, skeptical of humanity's wisdom, fearful that his life's work might have deepened suffering rather than diminished it. The newspaper had forced these two identities into confrontation. He had always believed his inventions might deter war. If destruction became overwhelming, perhaps nations would hesitate before engaging in battle. Yet the obituary suggested something different, that he had not prevented war, but profited from its inevitability. This was not merely public criticism. It was a prophecy of legacy. And legacy, to Alfred Nobel, mattered deeply. He had built factories in dozens of countries. He had secured hundreds of patents. He had accumulated immense wealth. Yet in a single careless error, a journalist had defined him in 12 words. The merchant of death. The conflict did not explode outward. It settled inward. From that moment forward, every laboratory, every patent, every contract carried a new question. If I were to die tomorrow, is this how I would be remembered? The rivalry had begun, not against a man, but against memory itself. 2.2 Escalating tension, 1888-1892. After the obituary incident, Alfred Nobel did not publicly reinvent himself. There was no dramatic speech, no immediate philanthropic declaration. Instead, the tension deepened quietly, like pressure building inside a sealed chamber. Europe in the late 19th century was not a continent at peace with itself. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 had redrawn borders and humiliated France. Germany, newly unified, was strengthening its military. Britain guarded its empire anxiously. Russia expanded cautiously. Alliances formed and shifted beneath polished diplomatic language. Armament was not slowing, it was accelerating. Smokeless powder had become a strategic priority. Traditional gunpowder created thick clouds of smoke that revealed positions on the battlefield. Nobel's invention of ballastite in 1887 offered something revolutionary: cleaner combustion, greater efficiency, and improved range. Armies took notice immediately. Italy adopted it first. France, feeling betrayed, accused Nobel of selling military advantage to rivals. The French government investigated him for alleged industrial espionage. Though the accusations lacked substance, suspicion lingered. For a man already uneasy about his reputation, this was a bitter development. Paris had been his intellectual home. He admired its salons and scientific culture. Yet now, he was viewed with mistrust. In 1891, feeling unwelcome, he relocated much of his residence to San Remo, Italy. Officially, it was for health reasons. Unofficially, it was exile of a subtler kind. Isolation intensified. His letters during this period reveal a restless mind. He suffered from chronic ill health, headaches, digestive troubles, and worsening heart pain. Doctors prescribed rest. He prescribed himself more work. Yet the internal rivalry would not quiet. He continued corresponding with Bertha von Suttner, whose commitment to organized peace had strength. She attended international peace congresses and advocated for arbitration between nations. Her influence did not convert him entirely, but it challenged him. In one letter, Nobel wrote to her, "My factories may make an end of war sooner than your congresses. On the day when two army corps can annihilate each other in a second, all civilized nations will recoil with horror and disband their troops." It was an argument of deterrence, that overwhelming destructive capability would discourage conflict. The logic was cold, almost mathematical. Increase fear to reduce action. But beneath the reasoning lay doubt. If fear truly prevented war, why were governments investing more heavily in armament? Why were military budgets expanding rather than shrinking? Why did each technological breakthrough provoke not hesitation, but competition? The tension became philosophical. Was he a servant of progress or a catalyst for escalation? Publicly, his wealth continued to grow. Factories remained profitable. Contracts expanded. Financial reports offered reassurance. He was, by any economic measure, triumphant. Privately, the obituary lingered. He began to reflect more seriously on the concept of legacy. In his notebooks, he drafted fragments of ideas, not yet a final decision, but suggestions of future benefit. He expressed admiration for scientific and literary achievement beyond his own field. Yet he was not prepared to renounce his industrial empire. To do so would mean admitting that his life's work had been morally flawed. That conclusion was too stark, too simple. Instead, the rivalry sharpened further. The industrialist in him argued that invention was neutral. Dynamite had built railways and canals. Ballistic had applications beyond the battlefield. Responsibility lay with governments, not inventors. The humanist in him countered that wealth derived from destruction carried unavoidable moral weight. One could not profit from explosive force and claim innocence when it was used to harm. These were not debates held in public halls. They were fought in private studies, between midnight and dawn, in letters never intended for wide readership. Compounding this tension was his personal solitude. He had no wife, no children, no household filled with noise. His brothers managed their own ventures. His friendships were intellectual rather than intimate. Even admiration from peers did not dispel a sense of distance. As he approached 60, Alfred Nobel possessed power, influence, and money beyond what his struggling childhood self could have imagined. Yet something was eroding. He had mastered chemical instability. He had stabilized nitroglycerin. He had refined detonators but he could not stabilize how the world interpreted his intentions. The rivalry had moved beyond reputation. It was now about identity. Was he, at his core, a builder of civilization or a facilitator of destruction? Could he be both? And if he were both, which truth would endure after his death? Between 1888 and 1892, these questions hardened from passing concerns into persistent companions. The world continued arming itself, and Alfred Nobel, surrounded by patents and profits, found himself increasingly armed against his own conscience. 2.3 Social Acceptance and Battle for Status, 1892 to 1895. By the early 1890s, Alfred Nobel stood at a strange summit. He was one of Europe's wealthiest industrialists. His factories operated across borders. His patents shaped modern engineering. Yet despite his power, he did not belong comfortably anywhere. In Paris, suspicion had cooled, but never fully disappeared. The French authorities remained uneasy about Ballastite and his dealings with Italy. Though no formal conviction materialized, the atmosphere was inhospitable. Nobel sensed that admiration for his intellect coexisted with distrust of his industry. So, I voudrais, physically to San Remo. Emotionally further still, San Remo offered sea air and quiet. His villa overlooked the Mediterranean, surrounded by gardens and sunlight. To an observer it seemed an ideal retreat for a wealthy gentleman of science, but the tranquility masked internal unrest. Social acceptance had always eluded him. Unlike banking dynasties or aristocratic families, Nobel's fortune had been earned through chemicals and contracts, not inherited estates or titles. He possessed immense wealth, but lacked pedigree. In elite circles, lineage still carried weight. He was welcomed as a curiosity, the brilliant, multilingual inventor. yet he remained slightly outside the inner circle of Europe's old aristocracy. His money commanded respect. His personality did not invite intimacy. He could be sharp in conversation. He disliked superficiality. He distrusted flattery. Many found him compelling. Few found him warm. This gap between recognition and belonging deepened the rivalry within him. Publicly, he was a titan of industry. Privately, he was a man questioning whether that industry defined him too narrowly. The peace movement was gaining momentum across Europe during this period. International arbitration societies formed. Conferences debated disarmament. Newspapers published essays warning that technological warfare could devastate civilization. Bertha von Suttner became one of the movement's leading voices. Her novel Lay Down Your Arms had stirred readers emotionally, depicting the human costs of war not in strategy, but in suffering. She and Nobel continued corresponding. Her letters did not accuse him directly. They appealed to his intellect and conscience. She believed that men of influence bore responsibility beyond profit. She challenged the assumption that stronger weapons would naturally produce peace. Nobel listened, if not fully convinced, then certainly unsettled. He admired her courage. In some letters, he expressed support for peace initiatives, even while maintaining his theory of deterrence. The contradiction was not lost on him. At the same time, his industrial success continued. Ballistite's adoption spread gradually. Governments recognized its efficiency. Though controversy surrounded its origins, practical military need outweighed moral hesitation. Orders brought revenue. Revenue reinforced his position. He had achieved what many industrialists dream of, international relevance. Yet he felt increasingly misinterpreted. In intellectual gatherings, he spoke passionately about literature and philosophy. He wrote poetry in spare hours. He drafted dramatic works. Few associated The Merchant of Death with verse and introspection. This mismatch between public perception and private self intensified his internal damage. The rivalry was no longer simply moral. It was existential. Who was Alfred Nobel when stripped of his factories? He once wrote that he had no family in the conventional sense. No wife, no children. His brothers pursued their own fortunes. His daily life revolved around work, laboratories, correspondence, calculations. Without his inventions, what? Vermined. Illness compounded reflection. His angina worsened. Doctors warned him to reduce stress. He ignored them. Work had become both purpose and distraction. By 1894, he had purchased the Bofors Iron Works in Sweden and transformed it into a major armaments manufacturer. This decision was commercially logical. Bofors could produce artillery efficiently. But symbolically, it was stark. The man wrestling with accusations of profiting from death had now deepened his direct involvement in weapons manufacturing. Outwardly, it appeared as though the industrialist had won the rivalry. Inwardly, the conflict sharpened further. He could justify the acquisition economically. Sweden required modern industry. Bofors provided employment and technological advancement. Yet he could not entirely silence the question that had first surfaced in 1888. If he were remembered solely for artillery and explosives, would that be enough? He began drafting versions of a will. Early drafts were conventional, provisions for relatives, instructions for estate management. But over time something shifted. Notes appeared about rewarding scientific achievement, mentions of literature, even references to promoting peace. The idea did not emerge fully formed. It evolved gradually, as though he were testing possibilities in thought before committing them to law. In conversations with acquaintances, he occasionally hinted at dissatisfaction with how wealth was typically inherited and dissipated. Fortunes passed to heirs could weaken over generations. Industries could crumble. Names could fade. He desired something different, not merely preservation of capital, but preservation of influence. This was the battle for status at its most refined level. Not acceptance in salons, nor approval from governments, but judgment from history itself. He could not control how newspapers wrote about him in life, but perhaps he could influence what they wrote after his death. The rivalry thus entered its most subtle phase. On one side, Alfred Nobel, the industrial magnate, builder of factories, owner of Bofors, supplier of explosives, architect of modern blasting technology. On the other, Alfred Nobel, the restless humanist, reader of poetry, correspondent of peace advocates, anxious about moral memory. These two identities were no longer content to coexist quietly. They demanded reconciliation, yet reconciliation required sacrifice. If he chose legacy over lineage, his relatives might feel betrayed. If he redirected wealth toward causes beyond industry, critics might call it hypocrisy. If he did nothing, the obituary from 1888 might become permanent truth. The tension between public honor and private truth became almost unbearable. To the outside world, Alfred Nobel remained powerful, wealthy, and productive. To himself, he was approaching a decision that would define him more profoundly than Dynamite ever had. The rivalry had moved beyond reputation and beyond industry. It had become a contest between the man he had been and the man he still hoped to be remembered as. And soon, that contest would demand an irreversible act. Chapter 3. The Point of No Return. 3.1 Event Planning, Build-Up 1895. By 1895, Alfred Nobel was 62 years old, and acutely aware that time was no longer theoretical. His health had deteriorated steadily. Angina attacks left him breathless and fatigued. Headaches plagued him. He worked through discomfort, but he could not ignore the steady narrowing of his future. The question that had lingered since 1888 now pressed urgently. How would history define him? He had wealth beyond measure. At the time, his fortune amounted to roughly 31 million Swedish kronor, an extraordinary sum, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. He owned factories, patents, laboratories, and the profitable Bofors armaments works. Financially, he lacked nothing, but security of wealth did not guarantee security of memory. He had drafted wills before. Earlier versions were conventional, distributing assets among relatives and close associates, yet none satisfied him. Each felt incomplete, as though it preserved money but not meaning. During his years in Paris and later in San Remo, he had contemplated a radical alternative. What if his fortune did not merely support family, but rewarded human advancement itself? Science had given him everything: education, status, income. Literature had sustained his private imagination. And peace, though elusive, had occupied his correspondence and conscience. Gradually, the structure formed. Price's annual awards for those who conferred the greatest benefit to mankind. The phrasing was deliberate. Not wealth accumulation, not military triumph, benefit to mankind. He envisioned categories: physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. The first four reflected his intellectual passions. The fifth revealed his internal rivalry resolved into action. The Peace Prize was particularly striking. It would be awarded to the person who had done the most or the best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding of peace congresses. It was language that echoed Bertha von Suttner's advocacy. The decision was not made lightly. Nobel understood the implications. By directing the vast majority of his fortune to a foundation, he would bypass traditional inheritance patterns. His relatives would receive only modest portions compared to the total estate. He anticipated resistance. He also knew that governments might question the legitimacy of such a sweeping philanthropic gesture, especially given the international scope of his assets. Yet the idea hardened into resolve. On the 27th of November, 1895, Alfred Nobel traveled to the Swedish-Norwegian Club in Paris. It was a familiar setting, discreet, respectable, appropriate for formal matters. There, in a private room, he signed his final will. The document was brief, but decisive. Approximately 94% of his estate would form a fund, the interest of which would be distributed annually as prizes. Specific institutions were named to select laureates: the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the Karolinska Institute, the Swedish Academy, and a committee appointed by the Norwegian Parliament for the Peace Prize. The international character of the awards was intentional. Nobel did not want national preference. He wanted recognition based on merit alone. When he put down the pen, he did not make a public announcement. There was no ceremony, no applause. But the act itself was monumental. In that quiet Parisian room, Alfred Nobel had chosen to redefine his legacy. It was not yet irreversible. He could have amended the will again, but something in his decision felt final. He had built factories that harnessed explosive force. Now he had constructed a mechanism intended to reward intellectual and moral force instead. The stage was set. Soon, death would come, not mistakenly reported, but real, and with it would come confrontation. 3.2 Confrontation 189-61901. Alfred Nobel died on the 10th of December 1896 in San Remo, Italy. This time, there was no mistake. The angina that had tormented him for years finally overcame him. He was 63 years old. At his bedside were servants and physicians. Not family, not close companions. The man who had commanded factories across continents died in relative quiet. News traveled swiftly through Europe. Industrial circles mourned a brilliant inventor. Newspapers recalled dynamite, patents, factories, and wealth. Yet the true shock came not from his death, but from the reading of his will. When the document was opened, disbelief spread almost immediately. Nearly his entire fortune, roughly 94%, was to be placed into a fund. The interest would finance annual prizes in physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. His relatives were allocated only limited sums. To his family, the decision felt like betrayal. They had expected inheritance in proportion to his immense wealth. Instead, they discovered that Alfred Nobel had chosen posterity over bloodline. Confusion turned to anger. Legal objections were raised. Some questioned whether he had been mentally sound when drafting the will. Beyond the family, authorities were equally unsettled. The will required coordination across nations. Nobel's assets were scattered in multiple countries, subject to varying legal systems. Establishing an international prize based on his specifications demanded administrative clarity that did not yet exist. Swedish institutions were surprised to find themselves responsible for executing such a grand vision. The Peace Prize, uniquely assigned to a Norwegian committee, reflected the political union between Sweden and Norway at the time, but it also raised questions of jurisdiction and national interest. Some critics suspected hidden motives. Was this an attempt to cleanse his name? A final act of vanity? An effort to rewrite the obituary that had haunted him since 1888? The confrontation was not loud in the streets. It unfolded in courtrooms, ministries, and private negotiations. The executors of the will, Ragnar Solman and Rudolf Liljequist, faced formidable obstacles. They needed to secure assets, convert industrial holdings into liquid capital, and persuade skeptical institutions to accept responsibility. For several years, progress was slow. Family members contested provisions. Governments examined legal technicalities. The sheer scale of the estate complicated matters. Nobel's investments spanned factories, shares, patents, and properties. Consolidating them into a unified foundation required patience and diplomacy. Meanwhile, public opinion wavered between admiration and suspicion. To some, the bequest was visionary. A wealthy industrialist, redirecting his fortune to honor science and peace, seemed unprecedented in scope. To others, it appeared paradoxical, an arms manufacturer funding a peace prize. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Yet that contradiction was precisely the point. In death, Alfred Nobel could not defend himself in speeches or interviews. His will became his final argument. Instead of rebutting the title Merchant of Death with words, he answered with structure. A permanent institution designed to reward human advancement. By 1900, the Nobel Foundation was formally established to manage the funds and administer the prizes. Detailed statutes were drafted to clarify procedures, selection processes, and financial governance. The legal battles subsided gradually. Relatives accepted settlements. Institutions accepted their roles. The machinery of Nobel's final vision began to turn. Then, in 1901, 5 years after his death, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded. The ceremony took place in Stockholm for the scientific and literary prizes, and in Christiania, now Oslo, for the Peace Prize. The recipients represented international achievement rather than national preference. Honoring Nobel's explicit instruction, the Peace Prize was shared between Henry Dunant, founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Frédéric Passy, a leading French peace activist. The symbolism was unmistakable. Dunant had witnessed the carnage of the Battle of Solferino and worked to alleviate suffering. Passy advocated arbitration between nations. Their recognition stood in deliberate contrast to the world of artillery and explosives that had enriched Nobel. The confrontation had reached its climax. In life, Alfred Nobel had been labeled the merchant of death. In death, his fortune now celebrated those who sought to ease suffering and expand knowledge. There was no opportunity for reconciliation between the two identities he had carried. The industrialist and the humanist would forever coexist within his name. But through the will, he had ensured that the humanist would not be silenced. The legal disputes ended. The prizes endured. And with their first awarding, the world witnessed the irreversible transformation of Alfred Nobel's legacy. The point of no return had been crossed. 3.3 Consequences and Aftermath, 1901 and beyond. When the first Nobel Prizes were awarded in 1901, Alfred Nobel had been dead for nearly 5 years. Yet in that winter ceremony, he was more present than ever. The hall in Stockholm was formal, restrained, dignified. Laureates stepped forward not to receive medals of conquest, but recognition for intellect and service. The gold medal bore his profile, a permanent reminder of the man whose fortune made the honor possible. It was the beginning of something far larger than even Nobel may have anticipated. In physics, chemistry, and medicine, the prizes quickly became the highest recognition in their fields. Scientists who transformed understanding of the natural world now had a stage of global prestige. Discoveries that once circulated within academic journals now received international attention. In literature, the awards signaled that ideas and imagination mattered as much as industry. Writers who explored the human condition were elevated to global audiences. And in peace, perhaps most strikingly, the prize recognized those striving to prevent or alleviate the very destruction that Nobel's inventions had once intensified. The paradox did not disappear. It deepened. For critics, the contradiction was obvious. The wealth derived from explosives now funded awards promoting harmony. The industrialist of artillery had become the patron saint of pacifists. But over time, the annual repetition of the prizes began to reshape perception. Yacht December laureates gathered. Each year, speeches emphasized contribution to humanity. Each medal reinforced association between the name Nobel and advancement rather than annihilation. The obituary from 1888 slowly faded from collective memory, yet the consequences of his decision extended beyond reputation. The Nobel Foundation's financial model ensured longevity. The principal remained invested. Only the interest funded the prizes. This structure allowed the awards to endure through economic crises, world wars, and political upheavals. And there were wars. The 20th century did not validate Nobel's early theory that increasingly destructive weapons would end conflict through fear. 2 world wars erupted, each more catastrophic than the last. Explosives and artillery evolved further, far beyond dynamite. Chemical weapons and atomic bombs would redefine devastation entirely. In this context, the Peace Prize acquired new gravity. Recipients included figures who challenged imperialism, opposed racism, and negotiated fragile truce. Humanitarian organizations were honored for alleviating suffering in battle zones. The prize became both symbolic encouragement and moral spotlight. Meanwhile, the scientific awards celebrated breakthroughs that transformed daily life. Antibiotics, quantum theory, genetic discoveries. These innovations altered medicine, technology, and communication on a scale Nobel could scarcely have imagined. The consequences of his will thus unfolded across decades, shaping global discourse. Yet the aftermath was not without tension. Controversies surrounded certain laureates. Political decisions sometimes provoked criticism. Some argued that awarding peace in a world still at war was naive. Others claimed the selection committees reflected cultural biases. But the institution endured precisely because it invited debate. It was not static tribute. It was living judgment. The most profound consequence lay in the transformation of Nobel's name itself. During his lifetime, his identity had been contested. Was he an industrial genius or a merchant of death? After 1901, that question no longer defined him exclusively. Children learned of the Nobel Prize before they learned of dynamite. Scientists aspired to the medal without necessarily recalling its financial origin. The name became associated with excellence. Yet history does not erase complexity. Dynamite continued to be used in warfare. Bofors evolved into a major arms manufacturer well into the 20th century. The industries he built did not vanish when his wealth shifted toward philanthropy. The paradox remained permanent. He had not undone the material consequences of his inventions. He had not withdrawn explosives from arsenals. What he had altered was symbolic weight. His fortune now rewarded intellect, compassion, and creativity. Perhaps the most striking moment of aftermath came in 1905, when Bertha von Suttner received the Nobel Peace Prize. The woman who had challenged him, who had urged organized peace rather than deterrence through terror, stood honored by the institution his wealth created. It was an extraordinary convergence. Though Nobel did not live to witness it, the prize awarded to her signified that his internal rivalry had found external expression. The humanist voice he once debated privately was now amplified publicly through his endowment. Over the decades, laureates would include figures whose work reshaped moral and scientific landscapes. They represented diverse nations, disciplines, and ideologies. Each award ceremony reinforced the idea that progress, intellectual or humanitarian, deserved celebration at the highest level. The consequences of Nobel's decision thus operated on two planes. On one plan, material. Funds invested, medals struck, ceremonies conducted. On another plane, symbolic. The redirection of a legacy from destruction to recognition of human achievement. But there was also a quieter consequence, one that history rarely emphasizes. Alfred Nobel had chosen posterity over personal reconciliation. He did not mend every relationship before his death. He did not build a family that would carry his private memory intimately. His act of philanthropy secured public immortality, but not personal warmth. The will resolved his rivalry with reputation. It did not resolve his solitude. The point of no return had indeed been crossed in 1895. Once the will was signed and executed, his fortune could never again be seen solely as profit from explosives. It had been irrevocably divided between origin and outcome. The merchant of death and the patron of peace would coexist in historical narrative. And perhaps that coexistence was the most honest legacy of all. He had built tools capable of destruction. He had funded recognition for those seeking construction of knowledge, literature, and peace. The aftermath did not simplify him. It immortalized his contradiction. Chapter 4. Resolution and Legacy. 4.1 Reflection and Final Battles. In the final years of his life, before the will was signed and before the confrontation unfolded, Alfred Nobel entered a quieter battlefield. It was not fought with chemicals or contracts. It was fought in thought. By the mid-1890s, illness had forced a kind of reflection he could no longer postpone. The angina attacks reminded him that the body had limits. The once tireless traveler between factories now moved more slowly, conserving energy. His letters became more philosophical, at times somber. He had accumulated wealth, influence, and scientific renown, yet he sensed something unfinished. Throughout his life, he had defended his inventions with logic. Technology, he argued, was neutral. A tool could serve construction or destruction depending on the hand that wielded it. In private, however, this defense no longer felt entirely sufficient. The 19th century had celebrated progress almost blindly. Railways, telegraphs, industrial machinery, all symbols of advancement. Explosives fit neatly within that narrative when blasting tunnels or clearing rock. But explosives did not remain confined to mountains. Nobel understood that his work had altered the scale of warfare. Even if he had not designed weapons personally in the beginning, his stabilization of nitroglycerin had made greater destructive force available. Later, with ballistite and Bofors, the connection to armament became unmistakable. This recognition did not lead him to public repentance. He was not a man of dramatic confession. Instead, it shaped his final decision quietly. The internal battle was not about denying his past. It was about determining whether his past would stand alone. In correspondence, he sometimes described himself as lonely, even weary of society. He distrusted human motives, doubted political sincerity, and criticized superficial optimism. Yet he never abandoned belief in intellectual achievement. Science, literature, and humanitarian efforts still impressed him deeply. He may have been a misanthrope, as he once claimed, but he admired excellence. The will of 1895 can thus be understood not as a sudden reversal, but as the culmination of years of internal reckoning. It was the final argument of a man who refused to let a single narrative define him. Yet even after signing the will, he did not publicize it widely. He continued working, overseeing factories, refining technical details. There was no grand speech announcing moral transformation. The final battle was inward and almost invisible. He had to accept that he could not control how his inventions would be used. He could not guarantee that future wars would cease. He could not erase past explosions or undo the deaths that had occurred during his experiments. What he could control was the destination of his wealth. That choice required relinquishing conventional legacy. No dynasty would bear his name through inherited estates. No children would manage his companies as heirs. Instead, committees and academies would distribute medals to strangers whose work he would never see. It was an act of surrender as much as ambition. Surrender of personal continuity. Ambition for intellectual continuity. In San Remo, as his health failed in 1896, there were no grand reconciliations recorded. He remained reserved to the end, but the existence of the will suggests a quiet peace, not certainty, but resolution. He had answered the obituary, not with protest, but with design. The final battle, then, was not between war and peace in the geopolitical sense. It was between despair and intention. He could have allowed cynicism to dominate, accepting that humanity would misuse every invention. Instead, he chose to invest in those striving to elevate it. The explosives remained in the world. So too would the prizes. And in that balance, uneasy, imperfect, enduring, Alfred Nobel found his last form of control. 4.1 Reflection and Final Battles. In the final years of his life, before the will was signed and before the confrontation unfolded, Alfred Nobel entered a quieter battlefield. It was not fought with chemicals or contracts. It was fought in thought. By the mid-1890s, illness had forced a kind of reflection he could no longer postpone. The angina attacks reminded him that the body had limits. The once tireless traveler between factories now moved more slowly, conserving energy. His letters became more philosophical, at times somber. He had accumulated wealth, influence, and scientific renown, yet he sensed something unfinished. Throughout his life, he had defended his inventions with logic. Technology, he argued, was neutral. A tool could serve construction or destruction depending on the hand that wielded it. In private, however, this defense no longer felt entirely sufficient. The 19th century had celebrated progress almost blindly. Railways, telegraphs, industrial machinery, all symbols of advancement. Explosives fit neatly within that narrative when blasting tunnels or clearing rock. But explosives did not remain confined to mountains. Nobel understood that his work had altered the scale of warfare. Even if he had not designed weapons personally in the beginning, his stabilization of nitroglycerin had made greater destructive force available. Later, with ballistite and Bofors, the connection to armament became unmistakable. This recognition did not lead him to public repentance. He was not a man of dramatic confession. Instead, it shaped his final decision quietly. The internal battle was not about denying his past. It was about determining whether his past would stand alone. In correspondence, he sometimes described himself as lonely, even weary of society. He distrusted human motives, doubted political sincerity, and criticized superficial optimism. Yet he never abandoned belief in intellectual achievement. Science, literature, and humanitarian efforts still impressed him deeply. He may have been a misanthrope, as he once claimed, but he admired excellence. The will of 1895 can thus be understood not as a sudden reversal, but as the culmination of years of internal reckoning. It was the final argument of a man who refused to let a single narrative define him. Yet even after signing the will, he did not publicize it widely. He continued working, overseeing factories, refining technical details. There was no grand speech announcing moral transformation. The final battle was inward and almost invisible. He had to accept that he could not control how his inventions would be used. He could not guarantee that future wars would cease. He could not erase past explosions or undo the deaths that had occurred during his experiments. What he could control was the destination of his wealth. That choice required relinquishing conventional legacy. No dynasty would bear his name through inherited estates. No children would manage his companies as heirs. Instead, committees and academies would distribute medals to strangers whose work he would never see. It was an act of surrender as much as ambition. Surrender of personal continuity. Ambition for intellectual continuity. In San Remo, as his health failed in 1896, there were no grand reconciliations recorded. He remained reserved to the end, but the existence of the will suggests a quiet peace, not certainty, but resolution. He had answered the obituary, not with protest, but with design. The final battle, then, was not between war and peace in the geopolitical sense. It was between despair and intention. He could have allowed cynicism to dominate, accepting that humanity would misuse every invention. Instead, he chose to invest in those striving to elevate it. The explosives remained in the world. So too would the prizes. And in that balance, uneasy, imperfect, enduring, Alfred Nobel found his last form of control. 4.3. The decline or final outcome. Alfred Nobel did not live to see decline in the traditional sense. He did not witness bankruptcy, public disgrace, or collapse of empire. His factories continued operating after his death. Bofors grew into a significant arms manufacturer in the 20th century. His patents remained foundational in explosive technology. Yet decline came in subtler forms. The Nobel family, once tied to vast industrial ventures in explosives and oil, did not become a lasting dynastic power comparable to Europe's great banking houses. The family wealth fragmented across generations, without Alfred's central direction, and with most of his personal fortune diverted into the foundation. The name did not evolve into a hereditary empire. There was no House of Nobel ruling industry for centuries. Instead, the name migrated from balance sheets to history books. This shift represents a different kind of outcome, not extinction, but transformation. His industrial companies changed hands, merged, modernized, and adapted to new technologies. Dynamite itself became one tool among many in a rapidly advancing field. The world moved beyond 19th century blasting techniques into new realms of weaponry and engineering. In that sense, Alfred Nobel, the inventor, became part of a larger technological lineage. His work was foundational, but not final. Innovation continued without him, but Alfred Nobel, the namesake, endured more vividly than Alfred Nobel, the manufacturer. The Nobel Prize outlived empires. It survived the dissolution of the union between Sweden and Norway in 1905. It endured through 2 world wars. It continued during the Cold War, when nuclear weapons, far more devastating than dynamite, defined global tension. Ironically, as weapons grew unimaginably powerful, the Peace Prize gained even greater symbolic weight. Thus, the decline of his industrial centrality coincided with the rise of his moral symbolism. Yet there is a personal dimension to decline that history rarely addresses. Alfred Nobel died without children. No direct descendant inherited his intellectual restlessness or his fortune. There were no sons or daughters to speak publicly about his private habits, no grandchildren to preserve intimate memory. His solitude, present throughout his life, extended into his legacy. The world remembers the institution. It knows little of his daily laughter, if he had much of it. It knows his letters, his patents, his will, but not the warmth of a household or the continuity of a family table. In choosing to direct his wealth outward, he ensured global remembrance but relinquished domestic legacy. This was not necessarily tragic. It was consistent with the life he lived, yet it marks a quiet fading of personal lineage. The final outcome of Alfred Nobel's life can therefore be understood in 3 layers. First, materially. His industrial enterprises became part of broader technological history. They evolved, expanded, and sometimes faced controversy, but they were no longer uniquely his. Second, symbolically, his name became synonymous with excellence. The Nobel Prize overshadowed dynamite and popular imagination. Third, personally, the man himself receded into abstraction. Few paused during prize ceremonies to consider the lonely inventor in San Remo, the brother lost in an explosion, the solitary reader of poetry who doubted humanity yet invested in its potential. History often simplifies figures into icons. Nobel became one, but icons conceal complexity. The decline, then, was not a fall from grace, but a fading of the individual behind the institution. Alfred Nobel, the person, dissolved gradually into Alfred Nobel, the emblem. And perhaps that was the final trade he accepted. He surrendered personal narrative, for collective meaning. He forfeited dynastic continuity for intellectual continuity. He allowed the industrialist to recede so that the benefactor could remain. In this transformation, nothing of his invention disappeared. Explosives continued shaping infrastructure and warfare alike. Yet, the emphasis shifted. When his name is spoken today, it is usually accompanied by the word prize. The merchant of death became the patron of excellence. That is not erasure. It is redefinition. Closing and emotional takeaway. Alfred Nobel gained power the way many industrial giants of the 19th century did, through innovation, risk, and relentless ambition. He mastered instability. He transformed a volatile liquid into a tool that reshaped mountains and accelerated industry. Railways expanded. Mines deepened. Nations modernized. Wealth, fluid recognition followed, but power never arrives without consequence. The same dynamite that carved tunnels also shattered battlefields. The same chemical brilliance that built infrastructure strengthened artillery. Nobel could control formulas, but he could not control human intention. And when the world briefly mistook him for dead, it judged him not by his hopes, but by the uses of his inventions. He won influence. He lost innocence. The obituary that called him the merchant of death forced him to confront a truth he could not dismiss. History does not measure intention alone. It measures impact. In response, he made a choice few industrial magnates would dare to make. He redirected his fortune away from dynasty and toward humanity's highest achievements. He chose recognition of science, literature, and peace over inheritance and personal monument. He won immortality. He lost lineage. The Nobel Prize endures as one of the world's greatest honors. Each year, it celebrates minds and movements that strive to improve the human condition. In doing so, it continually rewrites the first judgment passed upon him. Yet the paradox remains. The fortune that funds peace was built on explosives. The name that crowns humanitarian triumphs once armed industrial power. Both truths coexist. Neither fully erases the other. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy of all. Alfred Nobel could not undo the past. He could not guarantee a peaceful future. But he ensured that his wealth would not serve destruction alone. He left behind a world forever changed by his inventions and forever reminded, through his prize, that power carries responsibility. What he built with chemicals altered landscapes. What he built with conscience altered memory. History remembers him not as a saint, nor as a villain, but as something far more human, a man who profited from force, feared his legacy, and chose, in the end, to invest in hope.